Well, hi friends, Farmer Steve here again for your Better Get to Know a Garden update. This is the day after Labor Day, early September. Going to be one of the last videos. We're getting down to the short strokes, so share with you where we're at and maybe make one more after everything's pretty much harvested up, although as you'll see there's not a lot left to harvest. But I would like to start with a big thank you from a tribute that came in from one of our far-flung subscribers, Mr. Ed and Nancy Nowicki of Holland, Pennsylvania. Came out to see the wonders of Ohio in August, stopped by here, and they said, and I quote, Steve, we thought that going to the National Aerospace Museum down in Dayton would be the highlight of the trip, perhaps the Packard Museum, but we were wrong. It was seeing your garden in person. Thanks, Ed and Nancy. Many people have that impression. The videos just don't do it justice till you see it in person. A second subscriber, Mr. Brian Kastner, said, and I quote, Steve, you gave me a tomato from your garden and it was probably the best tomato I ever had, maybe the best in the world ever. Brian, I couldn't agree more. Brian also wants to contribute to the garden, and so he donated some of his heirloom garlics that we're going to plant in the asparagus patch that I'll show you in a minute. So we never get to see some of the fruits of the labor, so today I'm going to take some pictures of what we've actually gotten so far out of the garden, and you can see the example of the tomatoes. These are what they call the super sauce of tomatoes. These are very meaty. They're like big Romas. These are the heirlooms. These are delicious. And there's the last of the cucumbers. More on that later. And in here, some of the green beans. This is about a third of what I've picked. And Carol has done up quite a few and put them in the freezer. Okay, so here's the only squash that we've gotten so far. I'll show you a couple more down in the garden, but very poor results this year because of the Three Sisters garden. This is some summer savory that's drying and dill that's drying. So those are the two of the herbs that I harvested from the herb garden this year. And a lot of the produce is going to end up here in our new little chest freezer. Now, this time of year you cannot out-eat tomatoes, so I read an article about how to prep these things and just quarter them, core them, and freeze them, and then they're good to go for like sauces and tomato soup, etc. Well, we'll start with what's left of the herb garden, and there isn't much because, as you saw, with the dill and the savory out and no rosemary that came up, the cilantro was just a big bust because I didn't have anything to do with it when it was planted too early. There is quite a bit of basil, and Carol said she's going to make basil tomato soup out of this today, and that'll be it for the basil. And you can see it's about time it's gone to flower. It's starting to anyway. And we have a couple sage plants here that these are supposed to be perennial, so I'm going to move these all up here next to the thyme, which is also a perennial, but it only got about 6 inches, not much enough to do a lot with. But it'll come back next year, or so they say, and we'll see what happens and use some of it maybe as fresh thyme. So the asparagus has just gone crazy. They have loved this summer. Plenty of rain, not too hot, and you can see some of the it's still sprouting up, that things that look like asparagus that will be asparagus next year. And these ferns are just doing great. Got them propped up. Pretty soon they're going to die and I'll cut them back, but I thought that we'd be able to plant the garden or the garlic in between the rows here There's quite a bit of space in between each set of asparagus, so I think there's going to be plenty of room for the garlic. And but that won't be ready to harvest till next July, or so Brian says. Down on this half of the garden is the very, very disappointing Brussels sprouts. This was a big waste of time. You can see, I mean, these things, they're growing some sprouts down here, but boy, I just don't see how they're going to develop before the frost hits them. But to make up for the lack of Brussels sprouts, there is just a bounty of tomatillas. Boy, I need tomatilla recipes. Anybody have tomatilla recipes out here for send them to me, because I'm going to have a crap ton of them. Most of them are, you know, they're going to ripen. They're pretty full, but they aren't ripe yet. You can see kind of what they look like. They look like little tomatoes, but they are also overgrown and taken over what's our pathetic pepper patch. There's a few jalapenos, and I got a few Anaheims, but these things, it just wasn't good enough temperature and growing condition for these things to do much. I'll get a few more, but not many more. Carol actually had to pay cash money for some this year. So one of the great tragedies this year was the abbreviated cucumber season, and you can see there are no cucumbers. They succumbed to the powdery mildew. I had to pull them all out. We got enough to eat for ourselves, but boy, last year I was giving them away by the bushel basket, and this year they all just died. Had to pull them out, and better luck next year. Now, another major failure was the Three Sisters garden, more like the Three Sisters from Hell garden. I've had to pull up most of this corn. I just left a couple stalks to show you. This is what happened. I had corn all over this area with these beans growing up it. And all that happened was the beans grew up the corn, toppled the corn over, and the corn shaded the squash, so we got no squash either, hardly. You can see that I got one more growing here of that Harvest Moon, and there's one little butternut here, and that is about it. So, and some critters have got in here and pulled down the couple stalks that were left. It's just a mess. Very, very disappointing. What I think I'm going to do with the tomatillas is put them out here next year, because they can just go nuts and take over, and they really keep the weeds down. These stray tomatoes out here from what I threw over here, rotten ones, that they just came up and sprouted themselves. And then one of probably the biggest success this year is the tomatoes with this reinforcing canopy. I'm going to call it the tomato canopy. I might trademark it. It's really kept them pretty upright, and nothing's really, you know, crashed onto itself and strangled itself. And I don't know how many we're going to get that grow up top here, but it sure has saved the ones down beneath. And you can get under it and pick them and do your thing, but it's going to be hard to take down and put back up, but it's well worth it. Now you can see the blight is starting to get into some of these tomatoes, and it won't be long before this plant is dead and won't be putting out any more tomatoes. Now, one type that doesn't seem to be bothered by any of that is this little 4th of July tomatoes. These things really are prolific, and the tomatoes are very good. I think maybe next video we're going to have a tomato taste off, but that's going to wrap it up for September. Next time you see it, this will all be gone. I'm taking these down now and just going to let the couple squash finish up what they're going to finish up, and have a good September, folks.